they're speaking today somewhat based on that, but also really decades of work together and individually on political economy. Now, Leo has done his graduate work at LSE and has had a career at York University. Sam did his graduate training in this country, in Madison, Wisconsin. And tell me again the name of the Canadian auto workers. The Canadian auto workers. Worked for some time as a chief analyst, research director, these sorts of things for the Canadian auto workers, and is now at York University with Leo, directing the Center for Social Justice.
I'm doing a seminar on social justice and political activism.
Very good. Well, it's a terrific opportunity to have them with us today. Really very happy about it. Not apart from just the hole in the schedule, it's a really good chance to hear from some top scholars working in this area. I'm going to turn it over to them in just a second. I want to clarify first that they will speak, each of them, about 20 minutes. They prefer to hold questions until after they've spoken, so we'll take up the discussion at that point.
I very much appreciate being here. We're actually on a book tour promoting a book that we just published called The Making of Global Capitalism, and the subtitle of it is The Political Economy of American Empire. And Mary asked that we put that title on our talk today. The book is also a long time in the making, almost as long as the making of global capitalism to us sometimes. It began with a frustration with the globalization literature, which emerged with such a spurt in the early 1990s, which saw global markets bypassing states, sweeping all regulations, national regulations away, and it seemed to us that that literature, which tended to explain globalization in terms of the measures of globalization, how much trade, how much foreign direct investment, etc., was chasing its own tail, and moreover was part of the same illusionary discourse that neoliberalism was producing in economics and beyond, in terms of markets escaping states, markets being good and states being bad, and then of course the liberal left and social democrats would say no, states are good, markets are bad, and we felt the need very much to get past this. And the central theme of the book is that in many respects, states have been the authors of global capitalism. It's not multinational corporations that sign free trade agreements. It's states that do, just to take that one example. And in particular, the era of globalization, even if you define it only as the last 3 decades, and we think that's a mistake, we think it goes back to the current era, goes back to World War II, that the era of globalization has not been one of state withdrawal. It's not been one of deregulation, in fact. It's been one of very active state intervention in the making of markets and the facilitation of the spread of markets, in the creation of all kinds of domestic and international law, which facilitates market expansion, the development of market relations, and establishes procedures for the protection of contract, etc., etc. In this respect, however, there are states and states. And the book is a historical account of how it came to be that the American state in particular has been so central to the making of global capitalism since 1945. With the first 4 chapters being about what was it about American society? What was it about the nature of American capitalism. The first chapter is called The DNA of American Capitalism, and is more about the 19th century than anything else. So what was it about American capitalism that made its state so central to the making and managing of a global capitalism in the 21st century? Obviously, we don't have time to go into that type of economic and political history in a brief lecture, but in many respects, we think that the United States became, from World War II on, including the process that led to Bretton Woods, became responsible for, and to some extent burdened with, the responsibility for acting for global capital. Not just representing its own national interests and economic interests, or in narrow, crude sense that so many people understand economic power, not just acting for its own capitalist class. But it became to be burdened with the responsibility for the reproduction and spread of capitalist social relations internationally. An example I often like to use is Dean Acheson going to the International Native Garment Workers Union in 1939, speaking to their convention at the time that Roosevelt was trying to create the conditions whereby the United States could go into the war in support of Britain and France. And saying, look, if Europe does not sustain free enterprise, the United States cannot sustain free enterprise at all. And that kind of thinking is represented in the U.S. Treasury and the State Department through the war. It's articulated by the Council of Foreign Relations, by a remarkable pamphlet published by Fortune, Time, and Life magazine in 1942 called An American Project, which says the American empire in the post-war era, if you want to call it that, is going to have to take responsibility for the recovery of European and Japanese capital, and we're not afraid of doing so. We're not afraid of creating our own industrial competitors, because that is the way in which capitalism will grow internationally, the size of trade will grow internationally, etc. And the Bretton Woods Project is in large part, and this is not a matter of the Business Roundtable telling the State Department and the Treasury what to do. If anything, the leadership for that kind of thinking is coming from inside the state, rather than from Henry Luce outside the state. So the book attempts to show the extent to which, despite the gradualism of the project, despite the capital controls still permitted states under Bretton Woods, despite the fixed exchange rates, the long-term goal was always to get to a point at which there would be free capital movements, flexible exchange rates, convertibility of currencies, etc. And through a long and difficult and conflictual process leading to the 1980s, you finally get to the point where the project for global capitalism is being realized. And it's being realized very much through the agency of the American Treasury and the American Federal Reserve. The opening paragraph of the preface says, if you're expecting a book that has American Empire in its subtitle, yet another book on the role of the Pentagon and the CIA, this is not what this book is. This book instead is an attempt to show the very important and very active, and in a sense much more important role of the economic institutions of the American state, above all the Treasury and Federal Reserve, in the making of global capitalism. And we attempt to trace that through, the kind of role that they play together with the U.S. Trade Representative, the Department of Commerce, etc., in coordinating the writing of international law, international commercial law, that facilitates the making of global capitalism, the very close and intimate relations that have been established between the central bankers around the world, but especially in the IMF, partly directly. But more than that, the kind of role that has fallen to the American state in terms of crisis containment in a highly volatile global finance. In some senses, the growth of finance in the post-war era was such that it was already straining against and had moved beyond the capacity of the New Deal reforms and regulations to contain it by the mid-1960s, especially with the establishment of the euro-dollar market, an unregulated market, the ability of the New Deal regulations to sustain control over the amount of interest rates, how much interest rates each bank could offer to get your deposit, was known as Regulation Q in the New Deal framework, was already being worn away by 1965. Now, that didn't, because the euro-dollar market established doesn't mean that Wall Street wasn't still central to the international financial system. Indeed, by 1965, it was U.S. commercial investment banks that were already dominating the euro-dollar market as they do to this day. But it did mean that they could escape the New Deal regulations just through internal bank transfers, let alone through the larger role they played in the world. The facilitation by the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury of that type of role of international finance has been central to the economic history of the last 40 years. With an increasing understanding, as we show through the reading of, say, Bill Simon's memoirs and Treasury papers. He was the Treasury Secretary in the mid-70s. An understanding from the collapse of Bretton Woods onwards that although the trade deficit had produced a problem for the dollar, that you could look at financial services as exports. Not only through the role that international banks were engaged in providing financial services abroad as part of the making of global capitalism outside the United States, but insofar as the world's capital came to Wall Street to buy treasury instruments or to buy instruments produced by the banks themselves, this was the purchase of a service by foreigners, financial service, who could be treated as an export. And what was already being seen, although most economists still don't see it today, but being seen inside the U.S. state, was that the United States alone is able to sustain a significant trade deficit precisely by virtue of the fact that capital doesn't flow into the United States just to do the Americans a favor when they have a trade deficit. It flows in because of the depth of its financial markets above all. It flows in because of the safety of treasury bonds and the extent to which the world's capital looks upon the American state as least likely to default on its debt, as the ultimate protector of capital, etc. Of course, it also flows in because those who are on the surplus side of the deficit, the last thing they want is a readjustment of currencies which would undermine their export potential to the United States. So they keep those surpluses in the United States. So the American state has been central to facilitating this process, but it's also been very aware of financial volatility. Alan Greenspan, despite being one of the founding members of the Ayn Rand Society, does not, like most neoclassical economists, have any illusions that financial markets tend to equilibrium. When Glass-Steagall was finally being removed, 30 years after the horse had bolted out of the barn, he said to a Democratic congresswoman in one of the congressional hearings on it, when she asked him, well, if you want to get rid of Glass-Steagall, why does the Fed want to keep its regulatory powers? And he said, well, obviously, because we need to know what the situation of individual banks is when the next financial crisis hits. And he was always very explicit about it. report for Congress, as they were asked to do after the Mexican bailout in '94, we said, we're not in the business of failure prevention, we're in the business of failure containment. We're not in the business of failure prevention because insofar as we attempt to restrain and contain finance, it will not be engaged in creating the innovative financial instruments which are necessary to link together an integrated global production. The example of that, a great example, is derivatives, which was at the root of the cause of the current crisis, of course. But if you didn't have derivatives in currency markets, and this was quickly understood in the 1970s, flexible exchange rates developed, if you didn't have derivative markets in currency, you know, the ability of a Chinese firm that has just signed a contract to deliver something to Walmart 6 months from now would be much restricted. You might not have a profit left in 6 months if the exchange rate shifted even slightly. So what derivative markets do in currency arena, and they're the most important and largest, is allow firms who sign those types of contracts to hedge. And it's exactly what American farmers did in the late 19th century when they bought futures on wheat or on hogs. And it was indeed in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which had expertise in futures, where derivatives of currency markets in the 70s were first developed. The CFTC was created in the 1970s to facilitate the development of those markets. What the Treasury was saying was we can't be engaging in a restriction of those markets. They may be speculative, but they're absolutely essential to integrated production. But we can be in the business, and we need to be in the business of failure prevention. That is, when crises occur, and crises inevitably occur in terms of financial volatility, we have to be able to be intervening in a very active and immediate way to contain those crises. And, you know, there were 72 financial crises in the 1990s in low and middle income countries. Although most visibly it was the IMF and World Bank which were plugging the hole, it was always the Treasury above all which was engaged most actively on its own or with the IMF and World Bank in attempting to contain those crises, prevent them from spreading from one particular region to another. You know, and that also was the case with the 1987 stock market crash. Greenspan had just been appointed head of the Federal Reserve, and the response was to throw massive amounts of liquidity to Wall Street, but not only to call together the principals of the Wall Street firms and virtually instruct them to be lending to one another in order to ensure that you wouldn't have a breakdown of a particular bank, which might lead to a payments crisis and an escalation of this into a banking crisis. In the case of the Asian crisis in 1997-98, the Treasury played the most extensive role as that crisis spread from Thailand, Korea, to Indonesia, to Russia, to Brazil, and eventually to long-term capital management. And the kind of role that is played both involves throwing in liquidity, whether to states or to banks, in order to reestablish their credibility in financial markets. It always involves at some point the Treasury or the President of the New York Federal Reserve calling the principals of Wall Street together, and sometimes international banks as well, and instructing them to be lending to other banks. But it also involves the restructuring of other states. This is what is known by IMF structural adjustment policies. That is restructuring their state apparatuses and their budgetary expenditures so that they are more likely to be able to go into bond markets and sell their bonds, i.e. open up all the more to foreign capital, i.e. open up all the more to open trade, i.e. treat foreign capital the same as domestic capital. And the American state has been very principled about this, much more than any other state for a very long time. Of course, in actual practice, it does all kinds of things to benefit its own capital, but it's operated on the principle that when it other states, it doesn't just require openness to American capital. It requires other states to open themselves to all foreign capital. So as Korea, for instance, which had operated with all kinds of protections against foreign direct investment as it developed as a newly industrializing country, as Japan had as well, when those regulations were prized open. And the Korean capital had been calling it for a decade before the IMF and the U.S. Treasury made it a condition of providing the loans of the 97-98 crisis. When it was opened up, it wasn't so much American capital that came flowing into Korea. It was much more European capital. But it was American investment houses and international law firms who were laying the basis for that foreign investment and those mergers with foreign capital that Korean capital. Have I gone long enough?
Could you speak louder?
Sure. Okay, sorry. Let me move up a little. Mary, have I done my 20 minutes?
Too close?
Pretty close. I'll just say something in relation to the current crisis that follows from what I've been saying. It was widely predicted that insofar as it would all end in tears, because in the way it has, we're now in the first great crisis of the 21st century. The fourth great global crisis of capitalism, if you start from the 1873 to 96 period, the 30s, the 1970s inflationary crisis, and the current one. We're now in the fourth great crisis of capitalism. It's 5 years on, and it's deep and extensive, and it ain't over. And it doesn't look like it's going to be over soon. The expectation was that if there would be a great crisis in the 21st century, that it would likely be caused by American trade deficits, by an outflow from the dollar. And it wasn't. Not at all. That isn't what caused the crisis. And since the crisis, on the contrary, far from there being an outflow from the dollar, you've seen capital come pouring into treasury bills, being provided with rates of return below the rate of inflation. And they're coming here for safety, as has always been the case since the 1930s, when Roosevelt was being called a socialist on Wall Street. Any gold that could escape the capital controls in Europe was flowing to Fort Knox, because the American state has been seen as the ultimate state of global capital. It wasn't caused by the deficit. It wasn't caused by trade imbalances or capital imbalances. It wasn't caused, as Marxist economist like Robert Brenner believed, by a profitability crisis on the part of American corporations. On the contrary, profits have recovered since '83 and we're doing very well in the first 6-7 years of the new millennium. It was caused by volatility in global finance. In this case, very much an American crisis caused by volatility in the mortgage market. And with American workers having used their mortgages as a means of sustaining their standard of living as wages were stagnating, a source of credit. And those mortgages were then sold off as secondary securities and treated as good as gold, AAA rating, because it was known that the American state stood behind them in terms of failure containment. And those securitized mortgages were being bought by municipalities in Norway, by semi-public banks in Germany, etc., scrambling to buy them. And the American Treasury was issuing reports saying it was very proud of this fact, that the housing of the crisis of American black communities was being solved on the basis of financial securities manufactured on Wall Street, which are being purchased around the world. That was the source of the crisis. That bubble burst and immediately became global. The Onion had a great headline in November 2007, which said, "Bush proud that economic problems in the United States can still upset global markets." What is significant about the crisis as it's evolved is, number one, that it has not, unlike the 1930s, produced conflict between capitalist states. It has not derailed capitalist globalization. G20 came together in Washington, G20 leadership, not just the finance ministers and central bank directors, but the G20 leaders were brought together in Washington in October 2008, and they pledged themselves that whatever domestic policies they undertook to deal with this global crisis, that they would not introduce tariff barriers, beggar my neighbor policies, capital control. And in 2010, when they showed up in Toronto, you may remember the police riot that accompanied the protection of those leaders in Toronto, they issued another communique saying we were right to do this. And it's been very significant that unlike the 30s, this crisis has not produced conflict between states. Our thesis of imperialism, even though it's an historical materialist one, is a very sharp break from the Marxist theory of inter-imperial law. Indeed, the book shows very clearly that through the course of the 20th century, the other capitalist empires have, if you don't mind us using the term as Canadians, have been Canadianized. And that is reconfirmed in the context of this crisis. The great challenge will be whether the G20 states, where so many large states in the global south have been engaged in a classical process of capitalist development, rather than the development of underdevelopment, China, Brazil, etc., India, whether they will be as easily integrated into the empire as it turned out Western Europe and Japan would be. Much more challenging for all kinds of reasons, due to language, culture, size, class structure, state structure, and so on. But for the time being, what's remarkable is the lack of a challenge, is the extent to which there's coordination. And what's also remarkable is that there hasn't been conflict between industrial and financial capital in the course of this crisis. Although being rooted in finance, industrial capital has taken finance's lead as they have since the 70s. So it's taken the form of conflict between states, inside states rather than conflict between states. That's the form that conflict has taken in the context of this crisis, from Occupy to the possible development of a socialist government in Greece with Syriza, to the strike waves in China. What the consequences of that will be is another question, but this is what's significant, it seems to us, about this crisis.
Great. Great to be here. I'm going to follow up and overlap with Leo a bit. And I want to start with the fact that we're in this crisis, which a lot of people link to, as Leo was trying to emphasize, the decline of the U.S. And see this crisis as raising questions about whether there's still a material base in the U.S. for leading and reproducing this American empire. And let me just repeat what Leo said, because it's crucial, that when people were looking at this crisis, they were generally linking crisis and decline. They were seeing the question of that it was the fact that America, the United States, had these trade imbalances, which were signaling how weak the U.S. was, and that this would lead to a dollar outflow, or they were arguing that what we see in finance is a reflection of American weakness. Finance is strong because industry is weak, and that leads to the crisis. That's generally been how people have looked at this question of the crisis and its relationship to American power. And as we're arguing, that misreads what's going on. And part of the reason that it misreads it is because you have to have some notion of empire to read the statistics. You can't just look at national statistics and directly read off of them what's going on. So, for example, if you look at the U.S. trade imbalances, there's a few things that happen once you break that down. One is that you can't just look at trade anymore. If you're looking at the strength of American capital, you have to include multinational corporations. Now, multinational corporations do about 4 times as much production abroad as is exported from the United States. So the trade statistics are limited in understanding American economic power, industrial power. Second of all, when you look at the trade statistics, you do have to break down exports and imports. And U.S. exports have actually done very well. Next to Germany and China, they've outdone most of certainly the rest of the developed countries and most of the rest of the world. U.S. exports have actually been growing. The difference is that imports have been growing faster. Now, if there was anybody else, they couldn't over a long period of time. This has been going on since the end of the 70s. The U.S. has consistently imported more than it's exported. No other country could do this because they'd be limited by the currency and the exchange. Their currency would have to collapse. The U.S. can do this, and the fact that the U.S. can do this is a sign of its strength. It's because money is flowing into the U.S., not because anyone's forcing them, as Leo emphasized. It's because people, for all kinds of reasons, invest their money in the United States because it's safe, because the financial markets are so deep. So the U.S. basically gets to do all this extra importing over and above its exports as a bonus. It's getting access to the world's labor over and beyond what anybody else can get. So that's a sign of strength, not weakness. And there's the same thing with the emergence of finance. The emergence of finance is not simply a matter of, well, there's nothing else to put your money into in the United States, therefore you go into finance. We have to start understanding, as Leo was emphasizing, that finance is an essential part of globalization and the making of global capital. You can't make a global capital without financial markets that deal with uncertainty and risk and fluctuating exchange rates. Once Bretton Woods was over, there was a necessity for discovering a new way of dealing with the international economy if you didn't have either planning or fixed exchange rates. And financial markets essentially played that role, and financial markets have become essential both to workers. Consumer credit since the mid-90s has been higher than industrial credit, and to corporations who look to finance for those kinds of services as well as to dealing with mergers, and for the empire because it can import all this financial resources. So finance is a sign of American strength, not weakness. And when we look at things like, well, in 1950, the United States was doing 50% of industrial production, and today it's doing 23%, so it must be half as strong. That too is misleading because it doesn't get what empire is. What the making of global capitalism is about was the spreading of global capitalism so that there was more space for capital to operate within. So when you're spreading capital, as opposed to saying, okay, we're number one, we'll stay number one, when it's spreading to the whole world, and now it's spread to include China, to include Russia and Eastern Europe, it's including more than a third of the world that was excluded. It's including the third world that was in the 50s and 60s, a good part of which was trying to leave capitalism through nationalist and liberation movements. When you're spreading capital, it's expanding multiple times the space for capital to accumulate. When we look at what's been happening in the U.S. in a more micro way, the term that's often used is the hollowing out of American industry. And that's true for the working class. And you have to look at what's been happening in the U.S. in terms of necessity. It's good or it's bad in class terms. It's been bad for workers, but it's been good for capital. Capital has been restructured. American capital has in fact been remarkably dynamic. It's been introducing new technologies. It's been transforming the workplace. It's been changing the way it organizes production in terms of outsourcing. In addition, of course, to doing the outsourcing not just domestically but internationally. It's moved to just-in-time production. It's spread industry. You look at Detroit, and you can't understand how can you have an empire that includes places like Detroit and Baltimore, but the fact is that it's been very dynamic in other parts of the United States, throughout the Southwest. It's also been shifting very much from production to services, and that shouldn't be underestimated. Doug Henwood has said that one of the problems with Marxists when they analyze the economy is they think that if it doesn't hurt when it drops from your toe, it doesn't count. And we have to take services seriously. What happens in services is very important. Walmart isn't just some retail company that trades some goods. Walmart is a very high-tech company. Some of the most rapid growth in the U.S. economy is occurring in the retail sector. It's high-tech and low wages. And even when you're just sticking to manufacturing, manufacturing in the U.S. in terms of value added, not in terms of jobs, in terms of value added, has grown faster than GDP in the U.S. productivity in U.S. manufacturing was going faster than it did in the 50s and 60s, so-called golden age. And a lot of that is the restructuring in manufacturing towards high-tech manufacturing. And it's American corporations that generally overwhelmingly still lead once you start taking a look at high-tech manufacturing. Computers, pharmacare, scientific instruments, aerospace, etc. So one of the things that's happening with what's called neoliberalism and neoliberal globalization and the restructuring of the American economy has very much affected the labor market. In addition to the fact that profits have recovered and done so well, you've had an enormous inequality within the U.S., and that equality has had a couple of implications, one of which is the polarization in the workforce. One of the impacts of the restructuring of the American economy is that inequality has meant that the rich have actually wanted a lot of services, an explosion of services, which are very low paid. A lot of it has been immigrant labor. So you've had that end of the labor market. And then you've had this high-tech sector of the U.S., which is relatively high paid. And that's within the workforce. Then, of course, you've got the incredible increase in equality overall in the U.S. So it's crucial when we're talking about what's happening in the U.S., labor has been weakened and capital has been strengthened, and the two actually go completely together. Part of reproducing the American empire has been the necessity of defeating labor, which is what happened in the last crisis. So let me just raise one other, let me just say something about the crisis then. So what Leo and I are arguing is that if you want to understand the crisis, you can't understand it in terms of balances, in terms of the run on the dollar, in terms of the decline of the material base. What you have to do to understand this crisis is go back to how they came out of the last crisis. And one of the crucial things coming out of the last crisis was weakening labor. And it's the weakness of labor this time, as opposed to the strength of labor, the economic strength of labor in the 70s, that is crucial to understanding this crisis. And the other point about this is the nature of finance. Not that finance is speculative and is undermining industry, but it's become very important to industry, but it's unbelievably volatile. And what you see in finance is that as interest rates fell and the returns were low, the response in finance, which is in competition, intense competition globally, was to increase its leverage, so it can make more from a particular capital base, and to take higher risk, which means going into other parts of the housing market. And it's the way worker credit, consumer credit, which has mostly become mortgage credit, used to be about 70% of worker credit was mortgages, it's about 80% now. The way worker credit and the financial markets intersected was primarily through housing. And when the housing market bursts, you've got finance freezing, which affects their loans in industry and the economy. But for workers it meant, because it's based on housing, you've got this immediate impact on the economy. Finance and industry, the difference gets blurred in housing. And its impact on construction, on appliances, on furniture, etc. But above all, it's that housing had moved from being a home to workers' main asset. And because it's their main asset, the collapse of the housing bubble means that they don't have that asset to borrow on it and to sustain their consumption. And they therefore start to leverage, trying to restore some savings that is not going to come from housing. So that's how the crisis has to be understood. Now, one other element of this question of decline is, well, okay, that's all fine and good, the U.S. is restructuring, but isn't it going to be overrun by China anyways? And the point about China is, China has grown enormously, obviously, and it's going to continue to grow, and we're not trying to predict what's going to happen in 40 or 50 years. And there's going to be tensions with China, because China is going to be renegotiating its position within global capitalism. But the crucial point is, it's renegotiating its position within global capitalism. China sees its main mode of accumulation, the key to its stability and growth, through the integration into global capital, and it's been integrated to an extent that's far greater than any late developer has ever done, in terms of its dependence on foreign markets rather than markets at home, in terms of technology, and where it invests its funds. So China is incredibly interested and has a stake in the reproduction of a global capitalism that is being led by the US. For China to challenge the US would mean that it actually does something different with the with the dollars and the treasury bills it's accumulating. And China isn't about to do that by liberalizing Chinese finance. A key part of how the Chinese state, Chinese Communist Party, reproduces itself is through its control of finance, in terms of the allocating of finance, and it's not going to give that up. That is too risky. When we're making projections into the future, we can't make them just on a straight line basis. We have to recognize that the nature of the social relations within China are changing through this period of time. So it's not just a communist party that maybe is cheating and trying to get all this Western technology and then is going to change course. It's actually developing a Chinese capitalist class, including Chinese communists, and that's creating a different kind of a capitalist class in terms of thinking about whether this capitalist class would at all want to challenge. And above all, we have to just appreciate that, as Leo has said, in terms of trying to imagine China duplicating what the Treasury does in terms of managing financial markets, it just doesn't have the capacity to do that. And above all, it doesn't want the burden of doing it. It's not interested in playing that role in the world. It's concerned with how does it move towards development through its relationship to the global economy. Okay, so let me just conclude on two things. One is on how we think about where we're going to come out of this crisis, and then I want to say something more political. Every time there's a crisis, it's because there's been barriers to capitalist development, and something gets changed if they get out. When you're in a crisis, you never know whether you're actually going to get out of it. That's why these crises, these major crises that Leo talked about, last a decade or more. There's this great uncertainty. And in the crisis of the 70s, what changed was they broke the back of labor, they liberalized finance, they moved to a more internationalized production, which meant that the third world actually got integrated into manufacturing. It wasn't just a resource base. And a key question was breaking inflation. In this crisis, we're not out of it yet. Right? I don't know how we're going to come out of it yet, but a couple of things are clear. One thing is that neoliberalism seems to be continuing. To the extent that the private sector was broken last time, now what's happening is we're seeing private sector unions, sorry. Thank you. To the extent that private sector unions were broken last time, now it's public sector unions that are going to be attacked. Neoliberalism is continuing in terms of what's happening in the workforce is being intensified. The notion that workers under capitalism are commodities, they sell their labor, is being deepened. They're not just selling their labor, but now it's being cut up into pieces. So you've got casual workers, workers who are working split shifts, and this polarization within the labor market. So you've got something quite profound happening in the labor market. At the state level, we've seen very profound changes in the capacities of the American state. What the Federal Reserve and the state and the Treasury have been doing is remarkable in terms of finding ways to make sure that the financial system didn't collapse and the system kept going, and they're doing things that were unimaginable a short while ago. We don't know what other changes are going to happen within the restructuring of the state, healthcare to some extent, obviously. There's also the sense that the making of globalization is very much continuing. What we're seeing in Europe is both the contradictions of the making of globalization, of global capitalism, but also a drive to take financial markets even deeper and integrate them even deeper and integrate Europe further. So we don't know where that is going. And one of the arguments that Leo and I have been arguing is we also think that at some point the system is just too irrational not to imagine them coming to some of their senses and trying to raise the question of actually having to do some massive infrastructure in the U.S. The question is what kind of infrastructure is there going to be. So just politically, a few very quick points. We've emphasized that the contradictions are going to be at home. One of the things that has to be raised, and it has to be raised even if it doesn't seem like it's on the agenda right now, but if we're at all serious about changing the nature of society, if we have any other goals and vision than what's been going on in terms of equality or what's important in life, we have to address the power of the banks. Unless we take on the power of the banks and treat them as a democratic public utility, we can't do other things that we want to talk about. So that's absolutely fundamental. They're treated as a public utility whenever they're in crisis in terms of bailing them out, and we have to raise the question of the banks. Now, to raise the question of the banks, to begin a discussion now, raises the question of political power. And we have to start thinking about how we build the kind of capacity that can take on the very large things we're thinking about. Because it isn't going to come through, as Leah emphasized, splits within capital, either international or domestically. And what has really struck Leo and I traveling around the country is how much is going on in different communities and how impressive it is compared to our own country, but we think probably impressive relative to most countries. So it shows the potential, but it is still very sporadic and fragmented, and it doesn't match what we're up against. So one of the questions is, how do we actually raise a new layer of develop a new layer of politics in this country? And that's an organizational question. It can't just happen spontaneously. And that question of organization is so fundamental because the real barrier to people getting into motion today is fatalism. It's not that they think the system is wonderful. It's either that they've done some things and it hasn't gone anywhere, it hasn't built anything, so they kind of retreat as an occupy and fade away from things, or they're not even ready to try things because they don't see structures through which they can work and will matter. So the question comes down, and the real challenge comes down to us, how do we start building the kind of organizations and move away from the illusion that somehow we'll take power just by protesting or complaining, and start taking on the serious question of how do we develop a new layer of politics. Thank you.
We're going to take a few questions at a time, but let me take 1 second to say we missed not to mention our co-sponsors, which were both Portland Center for Public Humanities and KBO Global Radio, as well as the Econ Department Seminar Series. So that plug aside, we now have a moment for questions. People have questions? Jay?
If I'm synthesizing this correctly, it is the larger you get, the more likely you're to say open to all rather than open to only us. Pretty much get that one right? And so what I would tend to look for in this kind of situation is that are there other historical parallels, different eras when the same kind of patterns have emerged? And so was this the case in pre-World War II when we're looking at Great Britain? Was it the case with China in the 16th century? Was it the case with Greek drachma, Romans, and so on down the line? And is it also true going forward if you're thinking about this process having on an incremental basis? So with unification of Europe, was this a giant leap then in all rather than just us? Was it a reverse process? And I understand that trade and finance is a little bit different with the breakup of the Soviet Union. I mean, I'm coming at it with a couple of different possibilities for finding all these historical parallels that were there. Do they fit this particular model? So is it a replicable process?
Can we take a few?
Are there other questions or comments to raise at this time?
Just take into account so the coming constraint of monetary limits and energy and all of that, how you see that playing a role.
I thought they were answering essentially, so I'll take her turn.
Oh, please do.
I was wondering if you covered in the making of global capitalism the issue related to fraud. That's one thing we haven't heard yet.
Fraud?
The issue related to fraud, how profits are privatized and risks are socialized, conflicts of interest revolving your massive corporate lobbying, the moral hazards with being too big to fail, the golden parachutes rewarding executive failure, and just the massive fraud that is instrumental in creating and sustaining financial crises.
Shall we take one more?
Yeah.
Will there be enough growth to allow all these debts to be repaid? And if there will not be enough growth, what happens then?
Okay. Let's take the first one. What we're trying to do here, and this is the sense in which Mary suggested we subtitle this the historical materialist analysis, is come up with a better understanding of the evolution of for its own time, in the run-up to World War I, the great Marxist theorists of imperialism, Hilferding to Lenin to Luxemburg to Carnot, etc., who were borrowing from the British proto-Keynesian Hobson, were probably getting it wrong, even then, because although they understood very well the significance of the export of capital as opposed to just the growth of trade, they tended to think that that export of capital was occurring because there wasn't space any longer to accumulate within their own nation states, within their own territory. And to some extent, even a great radical historian like William Alfred Williams accepted that explanation of the open door, which was the State Department's explanation for why they were going to Nicaragua, or Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders were playing the role they were in the Caribbean. And that was a justification for American intervention against the Spanish in Central America, but it was mistaken, obviously. It was a product of a given moment after the severe recession of the early to mid-1890. The notion that the United States needed to go to Nicaragua in order to accumulate at a time when California was barely a gleam in anybody's eye was absurd. I mean, it was a very dynamic capitalism that was indeed spilling out to the American West, and to this state, as it was spilling out as well into the Caribbean and into Central America, but it wasn't being driven by the fact that American capital couldn't accumulate at home. Now, that isn't to say that the era leading up to World War I wasn't one of inter-imperial rivalry. I think what Marxists didn't understand was the extent to which working class parties and trade unions would eventually create the basis for what we came to know as Fordism. That is, a great deal of accumulation would be done on the basis of high-wage proletariats, which didn't just happen. They resulted from trade union pressures, social democratic parties, and so on. But in that period, there was development of inter-imperial rivalry. It was largely ended with World War II precisely because of the extent to which American capital came out of World War II, and the American state above all came out of World War II, with the strength it had, and managed to incorporate the old capitalist empire within the American empire. It didn't begin with foreign direct investment. It began with the kinds of linkages established between the American state and European and Japanese state. And it was only after convertibility was established in the late 50s that you got this enormous flow of American foreign direct investment into Europe. And then, within a decade, a reverse flow of European and Japanese capital into the United States. You get increasing integration of the economies, as well as all of the linkages that go with NATO, the security apparatuses, and what I was speaking of before, the very close links between finance ministries and central banks. And that's a very asymmetrical linkage in which there's a hub and spokes relationship with Washington in every case. Okay. So we're dealing with a very, very different empire, and one that, as the 1970s crisis already showed, does not produce inter-imperial rivalry. In fact, as we show in our chapters on the 1970 crisis, what was remarkable about it was the degree of coordination in trying to get through that crisis. There were loads of tensions. There was all kinds of frustrations about the American dollar, and the American deficit, and American inflation, and so on. But there was a commitment to coordinate through the course of that crisis, which led to a deepening of neoliberal globalization beyond what Bretton Woods had already been the cradle for. I'll end with this, even from the era of the open door, much more than the old European empires with their spheres of influence, even if not colonies, the American state always insisted that it was opening the door to those spheres of influence, not only for American capital, but for all capital. Now, of course, a lot of that was often hypocritical. Very often they were intervening in states to benefit a particular American firm, et cetera, et cetera. But this has been the operating principle the American state, which has been different from the old imperialism, which was based on spheres of influence. The British, with Pax Britannica, to some extent played that role, but the nature of the American empire has been so much larger and vast and longer lasting than that moment of British free trade in the middle of the 19th century, overseen with gold standard, that you really can't compare them to in terms of their global effect and global role. I don't know if that's enough of an answer, but just to pick up a couple of the others quickly, Sam will maybe elaborate. The ecological crisis is very real. It coincides with this today, as seen in the most progressive solution to the climate crisis being the use of derivatives through carbon trading, which is what, carbon trading is. It's the use of derivatives in carbon markets. Right? And you see, in that sense, the enormous rationality of the system and, the degree of incorporation of so many environmental movements, including the Green Party, in its logic, insofar as they are the ones who are in the forefront of the call for coping with the climate crisis by carbon trading. Sam, do you want to answer the...
I wanted to actually go into the first one a bit more.
Okay, so I won't.
Putting this in the context of historical materialism is very important because the historical part of it is so crucial. So when you look at the United States in 1920, after the First World War, it's the main industrial power in the world, and it's the main creditor in the world. But it doesn't become the kind of empire we're talking about, because this required, development of a lot of different kind of capacities and ways of looking at the world. So it doesn't happen until after the Depression, when certain things are learned and certain state capacities are developed, and after the Second World War. And one of the things they're learning from that period is the dangers of not keeping the world open. In other words, if after the Second World War you end up with Europe being closed, or Asia being closed, it means that the United States is itself closed. And it opens the question of planning within the United States if capital doesn't have the limit to go there. So there's the beginning of, it's just developing. It's not like there's a master plan immediately. It's just developing in that sense. But it's also linked in with this very crucial point, and maybe I'm overstating this, but I'll say it anyways, that this is the first specifically capitalist empire. Now, there's exceptions. You see some of this in Britain. But the point about it being a specifically capitalist empire is that it's working through other sovereign states. So Leo has very much emphasized this point about the need to internationalize other states. That's part of making this kind of an empire. How do you get other states to say, we're not just going to close off our markets or just represent our capital. We're going to try to establish the conditions within our own territory for global capital to accumulate within our territories. So you've got these very complicated and difficult things that develop over time. And the point about a specifically capitalist empire is that it isn't just territorially based. In the same way that you can say when workers sell their labor, one way it's forced, but at the other level it happens through markets, it's voluntary. And with this kind of an empire, it's empire by invitation. So it's a very different kind of empire than has really ever existed before. That's one thing. I guess on the other points, the ecological question is where the great question of inequality during this century is going to happen. Unless you think the world is completely going to fall apart, and we've been arguing that if you think it's going to fall apart in 10 years, we can't organize to change that in 10 years, so we're basically giving up. But, the great thing is that this world is going to become uglier, but one of the ways it's going to become uglier, I think, is through this increase in inequality between who actually has some access to any kind of decent environment and who doesn't. I want to say something about the fraud. It's a good question, and I'm just thinking about how to say it so I don't get myself into more trouble. I think capitalism tries to present itself and to act in a way that's based on certain rules and laws and markets and legitimacy, and it's unavoidable that corruption and fraud come into this because the imbalances of power and the temptation. And I think they're really important to look at and to raise, but I think it's also a mistake to try to explain what's happening in terms of fraud, as opposed to in terms of the dynamics and contradictions of how capitalism operates, even when it's not through fraud. And I'm really trying to say that without underestimating the importance of fraud. And at certain moments in history, Michael Moran makes this point really well, that the way conflicts between different groups of capital get played out isn't just through some democratic process, but it's through one fraction actually exposing the fraud of another as a way of discrediting it so that it can rise in relative power. I don't know, Leo may want to say more about the fraud question.
I didn't like Inside Job much. A PhD student of mine did a truthfully critical review of it in the Journal Studies in Political Economy. It was a paper from my Globalization State Center, and I urge people to read it. It's in the, I think, spring issue of Studies in Political Economy. I didn't like it because it had too many connotations of, this is caused by greed, and it's caused by fraud, etc. Not that that's absent, and as Sam says, the temptations to it are enormous. But even moral hazard, which you raised, is not so much fraud as systemic. I mean, insofar as the role of the Treasury is that of failure containment, it's not stupid for bankers, all bankers, the whole systems operate on the premise that we can leverage to such an extent that we can expect that we're systematically important financial institutions that will get bailed out. Now, the trouble with taking a great stand about this, a moral stand about it, is that's what the German Bundesbank has always done. They've always operated on the basis of, well, if these guys do this, they won't go under. But what does that mean? It means precisely that the Germans have never taken responsibility for the consequences of letting systemically important financial institutions to go under. From 1974 on, when the first big banking crisis occurred after Bretton Woods, the German Herstatt Bank was about to go under. Had it gone under, it would have brought down the New York payment system. And the Federal Reserve and the Treasury had to take the Germans kicking and screaming into what eventually became the Basel process of capital adequacy. To this day, it's been the Fed that's been far more interventionist. And then this European Central Bank has been. It used to be said that the Germans read Hayek when everybody else was reading Keynes. And it was on the principle of moral hazard that presumably they were reading. But the internationalization of the state, which the American state represents above all, is one in which states take responsibility not only for managing their own economies, but for managing the global economy. It's asymmetrical. The American state does it more than any other. There's always tensions, even in the American state. It's seen it's still playing that global role and its own social formations. So in the German case, it isn't just a matter of having read Hayek. It's also a matter of German public opinion. The fear of inflation, like the kind of mass inflation you had in the 19th, massive inflation you had in the 20s as part of popular culture. So I don't want to just attribute it to having read Hayek, by no means. But I do find that it's more important to see this systemically. And one really has to go very deep with this. The mortgage crisis, in a way, part of the mortgage crisis has its roots in the great reforms won by the American left in the 1970s. What do I mean by that? The women's movement won the right of women to have credit cards. So we got them into the financial system. The great victory after the limits of the Great Society reforms were reached, when you couldn't have any more deficit spending, etc., etc. The great victory of the 1970s under Carter was the Black Democratic Caucus winning the, what was it called, the Reinvestment Act? The Community Reinvestment Act, which required banks to set aside 5% of their capital to lend to the black communities, which previously had been redlined. And it was a real reform. It was a real victory. Every banker in the United States opposed it except one Chicago bank. But immediately, the consequences of winning that reform was the facilitation of a market that Bank of America had already begun in and secondary security markets, and securitizing mortgages. That is, you're going to lend into black communities, you start getting the Federal Reserve, but you start doing it yourself, to package those mortgages into securities, and you sell them off, because you don't want them holding that debt. Clinton really blew that up. He was partly known as the Black President because of the role he played in getting black communities into mortgage markets. And the Treasury very proudly said, look, the world is anxious to buy these securities being produced on Wall Street that are facilitating blacks getting part of the American dream. And why shouldn't they? And then Bush comes in, and here's the fraud point, and he lets every shyster into the market. I mean, you know, what is the Republican Party at the local level? Probably know it here. It's real estate developers, real estate agents and developers. The congressional inquiry on the crisis, it's astonishing this isn't being used in the election, showed that in Florida alone, there were 10,000 people selling mortgages who had criminal convictions. And 4,000 of those convictions were fraud convictions.
And
So
the rest should have been convicted anyway.
it's part of the system, I agree. It's important to look at it. But the dynamic that produced this explosion in the housing market, the dynamic that produced securitized mortgages, was entrained in a much deeper way, one that reflected the integration of American workers into the private mortgage market. The way in which the crisis of black housing had to be solved in any socially just and rational way would have been through a massive program of public housing. And a correction of the kind of lousy public housing that had been done for so many decades before. But instead, the solution that the left of the Democratic Party opted for was to get them into the system through financial markets. And the consequences of that become horrifically seen in this crisis.
But if I can just make one point and then I'll be done.
Yeah.
Was that, you know, just looking at obviously a small number being reported to the FBI, they've been very consistent in maintaining that 80% was on the banking side in terms of fraud versus the individuals obviously applying for that.
Oh, I totally
So,
agree. Oh,
I think we're on the same
absolutely.
page about that.
And
Just
the
wanted to
stuff that was loaned under the Community Reinvestment Act was intended to be, you know, far more kosher and much less risky than the way in which the market eventually bubbled into, which had little to do with the Community Reinvestment Act. But some of the skills and some of the first securitized instruments were honed out of that original reform. And it's one of the problems with reform under capitalism. You squeeze it here, and it jumps out there.
There was one question we didn't answer, which was about the debt.
Will there be enough growth to pay off the debts, and if there isn't, what happens?
Well, you can't pay off the debt through austerity. Anybody with common sense, I don't know if you have to be an economist, you just can't do it. So the debt, either in the case of the U.S., the debt isn't, in fact, a major problem, given that the interest rates are almost free and its money is flowing in. And in countries like Greece, you have to just default on the debt because there's no way you're going to pay it. In terms of just, you know, something in between, yeah, you can inflate your way out of debt as has been happening historically. You can grow fast enough without growing that fast so that it's a smaller proportion of GDP. But yeah, we just have to be careful about getting trapped into this argument about you can't have things because of GDP. I mean, there's, you know, in the U.S. on a per capita basis, there's probably twice as much GDP, real GDP, after inflation than there was in the beginning of the 80s. So why are people being squeezed? I mean, I think that's the question to ask rather than just through the technical argument.
We'll take another round of questions.
Me? I just wanted to have you comment on China and U.S. and I want to go back because both of you said things that I thought might have been not contradictory, but it just, I wasn't quite sure, so clarity would be great. And I'll back up for this question here, and it has to do with U.S. labor and the idea that we've got falling wages, so production, consumption, right? You know, you have falling wages in the U.S. Labor market, yet the productivity has gone up, and you mentioned that one, Leo, in being able to do that. But at the same time, you have China more than willing, and most sort of international financing willing to come into Wall Street because it's able to so all of a sudden you have what's happening here is a sense that we're the network, the hub and spokes in the sense of being able to use that financing for doing this, and we can take advantage of that. Therefore, we can buy more than we export the whole time, right? So we're not an export economy, we're importing, we're sending our money overseas. At what point does that, and then you said that China really doesn't want to participate in this, doesn't want to become the Wall Street. So I'm saying is that at some point where you're going to see this intersection or this kind of threshold you're going to meet where no longer will the U.S. look so favorable as a secure place for capital to roam or at least to come in. And when do you see that happening? And then the other whole thing about you didn't like the movie, I totally agree with you. I mean, Althusser, talked about structuralism and that whole point, and I see that in fraud, of course, is clear. I mean, you certainly have that, but wasn't there. So that's just an aside. But a little bit of clarity on timing maybe, or even just how that fits in with the labor movement.
First, I wanted to thank you for a very stimulating talk. There's all kinds of ideas that you threw out there. One thing I want to go back, when you, something that came out of the earlier crisis, especially apparent after 2000, and I very much like how you grounded your analysis in the balance of forces in society tipping so much more towards capital. For me, one of the things that came out of it is the level of indebtedness that individuals have from cradle to grave, and I wonder if you want to comment on that.
So I had a question about, you brought up China, Brazil, and India possibly as examples of countries that may resist, right, this kind of the globalization of capital, American style. And I saw great hope for it in terms of, the sheer population. Especially living in India, I've seen this over and over again. And I thought, just the sheer numbers of workers who were in the economy and the difference, right, between the top level and the absolute bottom would cause a resistance to this style of capitalism, right, and this kind of spread. Ironically, of course, as you pointed out, the invitation to internationalize is such, it's so irresistible. So I wonder if you can speculate on what that resistance might look like.
I was hoping y'all could talk a little bit about organizations who are doing that work or are starting to do the work to not reform our system, but rather create something new, something, not reforms that are going to prolong capitalism, or maybe lead to the next crisis, but something that's actually genuinely different.
I'm going to add my own question to which is that right after the financial crisis and the giant bailout, we were having a fair amount of discussion in the econ department with some of us saying, we've just nationalized the banks, why don't we run them? And others coming back saying, that's impossible, that never works, you can't do that. And I was thinking, well, no, they've done it several times in Mexico, to my knowledge, and we know they have public banks in Germany, but I realized I didn't know much more than that to say about the history of publicly run banks, and so I was hoping you might be able to tell us about models. Jerry,
Can I speak one word? The mention of Althusser suggested another question. So these major contradictions between labor and capital, between capital accumulation and wages, between the environment and growth, etc., etc. Althusser talked about ideological state apparatuses, right? And I wonder if you see that the need for ideological state apparatuses will intensify because of these contradictions in the form of, let's say, commercial as well as political forms of promotion and propaganda to meet this growing sense of contradiction and growing awareness of these contradictions.
answer your question, but let me just say a couple of things on it, and maybe Leo can also speak to it. So first of all, just to clarify, we're not saying that the U.S. can't export. U.S. exports have actually been rising. They've been growing very fast. They're growing fast relative to most countries. It's just that they also have the capacity to import more because of the role of the dollar. And it's not just that U.S. exports are rising in high-tech manufacturing, which is growing so fast. It's in services, and it's especially in business services. Crucial to American strength, especially as, thinking of it as a pyramid, is its capacity in terms of all the business services. Engineering, accounting, legal, and of course, financial services. And this is very important because one of the reasons that finance is coming into the United States from all over the world, from Europe, from China, and elsewhere, is not just because the U.S. has deep financial markets, which nobody else has anything comparable, and not just because the U.S. Is the safest place in terms of property relations. Nobody thinks anything's going to be confiscated here. But it's because the U.S. actually does have this material base. They're actually looking at where are the possibilities in the world. You're going to go to Europe, and the U.S. actually looks quite good. And if you were going to put your money into Europe, the Europeans would quickly put all that into the dollar. They don't want to hang on to it. They don't want their currency to rise. So there is this real structural dependence on the U.S. It isn't just, a choice. It isn't something that's, over time they may say, yeah, let's diversify a little bit. But there's nothing going on that suggests that, they're going to shift this in any massive way. To shift it in a massive way, what they have to do is decide to do something like invest it all in a Marshall Plan for Asia. They're not about to do that. Or invest it all in China. As soon as you start talking about investing it all in China and getting the Chinese workers to consume and have stronger unions, you're raising other kinds of problems, never mind capital responding to it. And the other thing we have to kind of get beyond is the notion that if we raise the Chinese currency, that this solves any problems in the U.S., is simply wrong. All it means is that somebody else is going to outcompete China to export to the United States, whether it's Mexico or Asia. On indebtedness, if you look at it the way people survived in the 80s and 90s, it was actually, until the late 90s, it was actually more through ours. That meant a lot more. And through decreasing savings rates. That was actually more important than debt. And then debt starts becoming very important. Now the thing about debt is that debt wasn't growing faster in the 90s than it was growing in the 50s and 60s. The difference was that in the 50s and 60s, people's incomes were rising, so they could sustain it. And now they were obviously so fragile because the jobs and the income wasn't there. So, so it becomes very important. But one of the things that debt does is there's a discipline in this. In other words, it says to you, you can consume. That's kind of what's going to integrate you into the system. You may not have the income, but you can consume. And then the problem is, now that you've consumed, you really have this debt. And now you've got to figure out how to pay it back, if that means having 2 jobs or 3 jobs, or your son and your wife working. So that becomes a very important part of debt, is reproducing, getting you into that income and into the consumption and reproducing it. And it also affects you because it's an individual way of surviving, as opposed to being on the street or on the picket line. And that's had a profound impact. People start trying to survive individually. They do lose collective capacities and collective sensibilities and collective solidarity. On the nationalized banks, it's both a demand in terms of, don't we need this in practical terms to do anything? I think that's what it is. If you're going to do anything, no matter how difficult it is, if you don't start talking about taking over the banks, you just can't do things. But it does raise a lot of questions that are very difficult. So that's why it's dynamic. It isn't just you take over the banks and now the world is great. I mean, it raises the question of, well, how do the banks fit into the financial system? How are you going to deal with the global part of this? So you're going to have capital controls, which you would have to have. And then there's the question of, what would you do with the money? Because if you're just going to use it to restructure General Motors, then the question is, well, what was the significance of doing it? And if you're not, then you're actually challenging not just the banks, but capital as a whole. So this question of power becomes even more important. So I see raising the question of the banks as it's an ideological thing. You're trying to get people to actually think about power and democracy, and then to think about the limits on it, therefore what kind of power do we need to do it. It's the beginning of the discussion, but it's the beginning of thinking about developing capacities, and beginning to think about challenging capitalism, and weakening a crucial section of the capitalist class. If you could do it, you'd really be weakening a crucial section of the capitalist class as part of an ongoing thing.
Back in the early 80s, at the time of the Federal Reserve-induced global recession, pushed interest rates to 18%, break the backs of inflation, with that trade union militancy, bullish. We started arguing for democratically elected job boards. We have in Canada, I guess you have here, directly elected school boards that have the responsibility, legal responsibility, of providing everyone in the catchment area with every person under 18 with a place in the school system. Well, we were making the case for democratically elected job boards, which have the responsibility of placing everyone who was unemployed for longer than 6 months with a job. Now, school boards were provided with either the right to levy property taxes, or more often, they receive subsidies from a higher level of government in order to meet that legal requirement of providing a place in the school system for every kid. So you have to then figure out where would these job boards get the capital to provide those jobs. You could imagine they would be receiving proposals from firms, cooperatives, state agencies to be funded in order to provide those jobs, or you're going to convert existing plants to provide those jobs. But it would, take a larger amount, even in the crisis of the early 80s, a larger amount of capital investment than the size of the welfare state, the size of welfare payments, certainly the size of a UA plan, of a unemployment insurance plan. So how does that happen? Well, you can't imagine it happening unless finance becomes a public utility, and the surplus that passes through the banking system becomes part of a system of democratic economic planning, where those funds get allocated in that way. This is central to the ecological crisis as well, because it's central to conversion of industry from cars to some ecologically sustainable products. So I found that politically, in terms of reforms that are fundamental, that by talking about it first in terms of jobs, and talking about it in terms of local democracy, and then get into nationalizing the banks and turning them into public utilities, it becomes more acceptable to people. But I've also found, and really astonishingly, now that I think of it more and more in the last few years, there is so little writing on what it would mean for the banks to be public utilities. The best piece I know is actually by a parliamentary assistant to the German Left Party, the Linke, who's done a major paper of what that would look like in the German case. It would be easier there because they have Landesbanken, which are semi-public, and got caught in this crisis. They were buying American mortgage securities because it gave them a higher return. But you could start playing that out. But what's astonishing in terms of economists is how little work on this there is. And as Sam said, the nationalized banks that we know, Mitterrand nationalized the banks briefly in France, right? They were run exactly the same as private banks when they were nationalized. They performed the same function, right, within capitalism. So you have to imagine how this be part of the transformation. And the challenge to economists is to really start trying to do this. Try to think through what finance as a public utility could be, etc. The ideological state apparatuses is a great question. Clearly, we see the book as an attempt to further develop